Hello, Dr. Gundry. You are the author of the Plant Paradox series of books, the latest of which was just released. So, Gut Check: Unleash the Power of Your Microbiome to Reverse Disease and Transform your mental, physical, and emotional health. So, this is the seventh in the series. So, it's doing well. So, welcome back to Modern Healthspan, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me back. It's good to see you again.
It's good to see you. So, congratulations on the new book. In fact, I think you kind of previewed it a little bit when we spoke last time, that you said you were working on it. So great that it's been published. So just to kind of set the scene, could you talk about the basic premise of the book?
Yeah, I think the basic premise of the book is, I guess I've been spending now almost 25 years trying to figure out why Hippocrates was right when he said all disease begins in the gut. And that was a rather bold statement 2,500 years ago. And people like to poo-poo it because that was back before we knew so much. But in fact, the more I study the gut and its relationship to any disease you care to think about, the more I'm impressed that this guy was onto something. And so Gut Check, I hope, brings his observations into and puts modern science to back up what he said so long ago.
So how is the microbiome so strongly entangled with the rest of our health? I mean, how does it influence our bodies? I mean, because it's separated from us mostly.
Yeah, it's separated from us, but an integral part of us. And we clearly, like all animals, have a incredibly important symbiotic relationship with our gut microbiome. In fact, we know from germ-free mouse experiments that depriving an animal of a microbiome is fairly disastrous in terms of lifespan, in terms of behavior, in terms of mood. And we now are pretty convinced that we are a home to 100 trillion different sentient beings that can think, not certainly in the way we think, but can recognize each other, not in the way we think of looking at someone and recognize them, and that they direct much of our behavior. We're basically, simplistically, an animal who was designed by bacteria to carry them around in search of food for them to eat. And in return, they would make sure that the house they're living in, us, was kept in good shape and our needs were met. And that's a very good deal that, like Gut Check says, for the last 50 years, we have not held up our end of the bargain. We have tried to kill them and done a very good job, and we tried to starve them to death and done a very good job of that too. And I guess they're not happy, and they're not going to take it any longer.
How do they control us so well?
Well, for years, first of all, I think it's important for people to understand that we really didn't know what those guys were doing down there until the Human Microbiome Project got started in around 2010 and didn't get completed until 2017. And we had no idea, number one, that there could be 100 trillion organisms living inside of us or in our mouth and our nose, and that these organisms could manipulate us by a text message system is the simplest way to describe it. Years ago in France, there's a yearly meeting of the microbiota group, and at one of these meetings, I was talking with the professor, Marvin Edez, who's become a friend through the years, and we were talking about how the microbiota talks to, for instance, mitochondria or to the brain. And he said, well, they send them text messages, of course. And I said, well, wait a minute, where are these text messages? Why haven't we discovered them? He says, oh, I can guarantee you it is occurring. We just haven't interpreted the language yet. And he was very prophetic, because with every year we're learning the language, and it's very much like breaking the Enigma code of World War II, when the Brits broke the German code and learned how they directed planes, etc., army movements, without anyone being able to decipher this indecipherable code. And now we know the code. It's a very complex code, and this code is done in simplistically two ways. So the text messages are either in the form of short chain fatty acids, and the most famous is butyrate. And butyrate is kind of the holy grail of good health in so many ways. And also, what I wrote a whole book about, called The Energy Paradox, is gases that, if you will, bacteria ferment foods and they make gas. Those are farts, and if you want to call them bacterial farts, that's fine with me. But these gases actually are gasomessengers or gasotransmitters, and they carry information that literally are read by mitochondria, for instance, neurons, for instance, for information. So, for instance, who would have guessed that hydrogen gas would be an incredibly important gasotransmitter? And I mean, who would have guessed that methane, cow farts, is actually a very important gasotransmitter? Hydrogen sulfide, the rotten egg smell, incredibly important gasotransmitter. And I could go on. Nitric oxide is a gasotransmitter. And so, the discovery of nitric oxide won the Nobel Prize for Medicine, I think, in 2012. So anyhow, we're slowly but surely, breaking this code. And as we break the code, we realize that much of what we thought was just, a bunch of crap down in our bowels was actually a unique organism that had control over much of what we thought was in our control. And, I start the first chapter talking about toxoplasmosis, how a single-celled organism can completely take over the brain of its intermediate host and direct the animal that it's taken over to somehow find a cat to have the cat eat it. And it's actually a spectacular story of how this single-cell organism can control a large mammal, including a human, and their behavior. But it does.
That piece was really interesting. The way, almost like parasites, they control the behavior. So I saw one thing that was that there is like two-way communication, and you talked about microRNAs, which I found really fascinating. Could you talk a little bit about how the microRNAs work?
Yeah, and this is a whole nother, and it was actually just when I was writing the book, it was just started to get attention. But we've known for a long time that DNA, the information in DNA is kind of transmitted via RNA to, tell production machinery, if you will, to make things. And that's pretty well worked out. We know that viruses are mostly RNA, and RNA then infects our DNA, etc. But what we didn't know is, number one, bacteria have their own DNA. It's a circular DNA, but this DNA makes microRNA. And we figured, well, that's how it sets up its manufacturing. Well, hold on. That microRNA, we know, can diffuse through the wall of the gut and actually affect non-bacterial human DNA or mechanisms. Also, we now know that exosomes, which contain this genetic instructions, are now made by bacteria that can traverse the gut wall and deliver information, deliver instructions to the human host that we just, we couldn't possibly have conceived that, these silly one-cell organisms would be capable of that much interaction with the large superior organism that they live in. And yet now, yes, they do. And it's like, gosh, I guess we should have known that a long time ago. But luckily, the ability to detect these is fairly new.
Right. Yeah. Yes. So I was thinking, so, I mean, should you think of them as single cellular organisms or almost like a sponge or a coral reef that they're working together and maybe even cross species working together?
Oh, correct. I mean, this is, it's the phrase that I like is trans-kingdom communication. And it's literally, there's the fungal kingdom, and the bacterial kingdom, and the plant kingdom, and the animal kingdom. And we now realize that, for instance, just to use an animal as an example, there's no animal that can break down the cell wall of a plant in its digestive tract. It's impossible. And we have to have bacteria to do that job for us. Even a lowly termite has its own microbiome, and a termite cannot digest wood. It has to have the microbiome do it for it and then deliver those digested products to the animal. So kind of right from the beginning, animals are, in a way, completely dependent on bacteria to, if you will, save their lives in terms of delivering them food products. But it gets even more very odd. For instance, we now know that the womb, the fetus is not sterile. The amniotic fluid is not sterile. The placenta is not sterile. And that all of these structures have their own microbiome. And we're now discovering that you have to have the right microbiome to instruct neurons in the fetus to grow and differentiate and establish connections long before the baby's even born. And if you don't have that proper microbiome or have a dysbiotic microbiome, all sorts of mischief happens. The most obvious one now is autism. So, it's amazing that the construction, the intertwining, this kingdom communication starts before we even popped out of mom. And it's like, holy cow, these guys are really involved in making this organism, a functional organism.
That is amazing. Yes. Yeah. So recently, especially the gut microbiome, the last few decades has had a hard time. Could you talk about some of the some of the key things that are causing us to have dysbiosis, I guess, bad microbiomes?
Yeah, again, this was obviously a mutually beneficial relationship between the animal and its gut microbiome. And our great great grandparents, some of our great grandparents, ate whole foods and they ate them whole. Now, I don't mean to be flippant about that, but that's what they did. They're the only processing of food that humans ever did was harnessing fire. And the more we now study some of the architectural findings, we may have been using fire a million years ago. Certainly, good data show that at least 300,000 years ago, we used fire. So we were able to process food that no other animal ever was capable of doing. So, but even with processing, let's just take a sweet potato. Well, we would eat a sweet potato whole, and we would break down, because of cooking, the cellular wall of plants, and we could absorb those starches, but there would be a lot left over. There would be soluble fiber, which we couldn't break down. That soluble fiber would not be absorbed, but would be, if you will, left over for the remnants of the rest of our gut microbiome, which primarily lives in the colon. And that was the reward for all the hard work that they were capable of doing. And that was a wonderful process. The other process that we now know the microbiome did, and plant paradox became famous because, quite frankly, plants don't really particularly want us to eat them or their babies, their seeds. They do want us to eat their fruit, but only at a certain time. But that's another subject. So they have to protect themselves and their babies, and they use basically chemical warfare. And these defense compounds are primarily proteins, and I guess I got infamous or famous about talking about a type of defense protein called a lectin. And for you listeners, gluten happens to be a lectin. So our microbiome was the first line of defense against these plant compounds. And it turns out that the microbiome would normally love to eat lectins. Believe it or not, there's gluten-eating bacteria. There are oxalate-eating bacteria. And so we had a pretty good system of detoxifying these compounds. To give people another way of looking at it, fermentation is simply the bacteria or yeast eating these compounds, particularly sugar compounds, long before they ever got to us. And traditional societies, the only way to preserve food, and for that matter, making food safer to eat, was fermentation. We just originally did all the fermentation in our gut, just like any other animal does. So we were protected from this. We also know now that the microbiome would talk to the immune system, our white blood cells, and basically say, hey guys, you're here for emergencies. You're here for if anybody gets past us, and that's not very likely because we're tough. Then be ready to go. But don't worry, we got your back. Not much getting through us. It's like in the United States after a Super Bowl, it's like your offensive front line is protecting the quarterback from the linebackers who want to tackle him. Now, what's happened to us is with the advent of broad spectrum antibiotics, which literally came into being in the mid 1970s, which were miraculous. I was a medical student then, and I remember it well. they were miraculous because we didn't have to figure out which bug was the troublemaker. We could just give a patient antibiotics that killed basically every bacteria. And it was wonderful. We didn't have to work very hard. The problem is none of us knew that not only we were killing the bad bacteria, but we were killing all of our microbiome for the most part. And we just didn't know because we really didn't even know they were down there. The other thing that we didn't know that happened at the same time is that scientists learned that if you gave antibiotics to animals, they would grow faster and get fatter than if you didn't give them antibiotics. And so you could take a chicken that would take maybe 3 or 4 months to fully develop and get a chicken ready for the table in a month by giving them antibiotics. And what we didn't realize was that the antibiotics were in the chicken flesh. And so when we ate that chicken, we got another dose of antibiotics. In fact, 70% in the United States of all fast foods have veterinary antibiotics in them, detectable levels. Wow.
Yes. It would be interesting. Yeah, sorry, go on.
No, so I mean, we've literally taken kind of our best partner to move us safely through life and, poisoned it and burned it to the ground, number one. And number two, we've actively starved it by most of the food we eat is now processed and ultra processed. And we have removed all of these, niggly little fibers, which, who wants to eat fiber? And without realizing that that was the bargain we had made, hundreds and thousands, millions of years ago, with our mates in the journey across the sun.
Yes. It'd be interesting to think why giving animals antibiotics makes them grow faster, but not now. No.
It changes the microbiome.
Oh, right. Well, yes, it must.